You are listening to Mangoes and Malice, a full culinary cozy mystery audiobook by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. This is part 3 of 4 parts.
Mangoes and Malice, a Wailuku Town Cozy Mystery by Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Chapter 19. I don't know if I hit him or not, said Zoe, because I was hiding on the other side of the roof of the house when I lobbed that apple over at him. But a few seconds later, I heard him kind of scrambling, and then I sat up enough to look over. I saw him running away. I guess I scared him. Did he leave his takeout? I asked. I was betting that at least one of those takeout boxes hadn't had food inside. It had a singed jewelry box. I think he took the bag with him, said Zoe, but the bag must have burst as he was leaving and it spilled all over the street. Did he leave it all behind? I asked. That was the weird part, said Zoe. He didn't bother cleaning up his mess, but he picked up one of the takeout boxes and then took off again. I would have bet anything that the takeout box contained the singed jewelry case. At some point, the pseudo-delivery man, or someone else, had returned and left the jewelry concealed under the step. But that initial attempt to plant evidence at Nate and Harmony's had been foiled by Zoe's eccentric propensity for sitting on roofs. What did he look like? I asked. He was pretty old, said Zoe. Zoe was so young that anything over 25 was practically geriatric, so I asked for clarification. On further questioning, Zoe thought the man was near the age of her father. He was of medium build with dark hair. Anything else? I asked. He had one arm tattooed, said Zoe. What did the tattoo look like? I asked. I couldn't really tell. I wasn't close enough, said Zoe. It was really colorful, though. Do you know where the takeout was from? I asked. I went down and cleaned up the spilled stuff after he'd gone away, Zoe said. I think it was from several places. It was all cold and disgusting. I think it was just that creepy guy's leftovers. I don't think he was really a delivery man. That made 2 of us. Why didn't you tell me about this guy? Dan asked his daughter. I could see his point. Creepy men posing as delivery persons and peering in your neighbor's windows are hardly calculated to make the father of a teenage girl feel at ease. I didn't want you to worry, Zoe told her dad. Well, next time anything like that happens, said Dan, tell me. I'm your father. Worrying is what I signed up for. Zoe didn't answer, so I tried to smooth over the awkward silence. Thank you, I told Zoe. You've been enormously helpful. Zoe mumbled something which I think might have been, "You are welcome," and concentrated on the toes of her bunny slippers. So, neither of you has seen anyone else suspicious hanging around since Nate and Harmony were arrested? Dan and Zoe said they had not. Clearly, someone suspicious had returned to the premises at some point and gone undetected unless Auntie Alma had noticed them. An unidentified person hanging around the place would have been summarily confronted and questioned by Mrs. Tanaka, and I intended to ask her about it the first chance I got. Unfortunately, I needed to get over to Island Ice Cream and open up for the day. I had intended to wait until I'd closed up for the evening to have a chat with Martin, but when I called him and said I had a few questions I'd like to ask him in connection with the holdup of Frank's filling station, he offered to come right over to Island Ice Cream so our conversation wouldn't have to wait until I was done for the night. Martin showed up around noon, and although there were a couple of customers over at Veg Ed's, Island Ice Cream was in between diners. I offered Martin a cone on the house, and he settled on plain chocolate. I grabbed my water bottle, and we sat down at the table with the deepest shade from the overhanging palms. What I wanted to ask you, I said, is if you know much about Tammy Danson's social circle. I would have rather eased into the subject, but at any moment we might be interrupted. Ed's customers might very well decide that after a virtuous lunch of rabbit food, they deserved a little decadence and want me to serve up a pair of triple-decker cones. "We're not really friends," said Martin, in a tone that suggested Tammy Danson wasn't the sort of person he had any interest in being connected to. "But I am in a position to see most of her comings and goings. She and her husband live right across the street." "Donald?" "Yes," said Martin. "I like him a lot better than I like her, but then I'm biased against her because my son-in-law works with her and she's given him nothing but trouble. I was under the impression Tammy is very competitive, but is there more to it than that?" "I think so," said Martin. "She's the sort that would stoop to just about anything if you crossed her." I wanted to ask if that included killing a man just to get custody of his kids, but I didn't want to lay every card I had on the table. I wanted to get Martin's unbiased impression of Tammy, and telling him that I thought she might have orchestrated an attempted murder of her son-in-law wasn't going to get me Martin's raw impressions of the woman. "What I'm most interested in," I said, "is who's in her close circle. I want to know who comes and goes from her house on a regular basis." "Well, there's her daughter, Tiffany," said Martin. "She comes there a lot to dump off the kids, but she doesn't stay long. There's Donald's brother, Jack. He's there a lot, but mostly when Tammy isn't home." "Are Tammy's parents still living?" I asked. "Only her mother, but she never comes to visit. She's practically housebound. Lives way up near Hana. I've never been there, but Donald told me about it once. She's completely off-grid, and the road in is impassable every time it rains. Just the sort of place that probably had an old burn barrel." "Where exactly is this place?" "About 3 miles up a dirt road right before you get to the old store at Kaupo when you take the back way around to Hana." I had no idea what Martin was talking about, but I bet Steve would. "I've been meaning to make a trip up to Hana," I said. "Well, you won't be able to stop in and see Tammy's mother. She fell and broke her hip a week ago, and she'll be down here at the rehab center for a while." Perfect. I didn't need to talk to Tammy's mother. I just needed a gander at her burn barrel if there was one. Chapter 20. Martin had finished his chocolate cone, and the couple over at Veg Ed's were finishing up their cabbage and sprout, gluten-free, low-fat, whole-grain tortilla wraps and looking longingly over in my direction, so I decided I'd better hurry and finish things up with Martin. "There's one other person who comes around Danson's house," said Martin. "You remember how I said I thought Tammy might be having an affair?" "Yes." "Well, I see a guy coming around at strange hours when Donald isn't at home." "Do you know who this guy is?" "I don't know his name," said Martin, "but he works at Wally's Tires. He's mid-30s, I think, with blonde hair and a bunch of tattoos. The man Zoe had seen sniffing around Nate and Harmony's cottage with his stack of fake takeout boxes hadn't been blonde, but it takes only half an hour and a bottle of bleach to change that." "Blonde with dark roots?" I asked. "And one arm covered with colorful tattoos?" "How did you know?" Martin asked. "Have you met him?" "No, but a young lady of my acquaintance has." "Sort of." The couple over at Veg Ed's were making a beeline for the trailer, so I hastily thanked Martin for his help and sent him on his way. I was grateful to Martin, and I intended to act on the information he had given me at the very first opportunity. Unfortunately, when I called Steve to ask him to accompany me on my quest to see if Tammy Danson's mother's property might be where the case of stolen jewelry ended up in a burn barrel, he informed me that any snooping way up by Hana would be an all-day affair. "It'll take several hours just to get up there," Steve told me. "I'd suggest getting a very early start and making a day of it. If I make a day of it, I'll have to close up Island Ice Cream." I hated to do that. Not only did I need the money to stay in the black, I also didn't like the thought of regulars coming and finding the place closed during the weeks after Nate and Harmony had gotten arrested, and before I'd arrived to take over, Island Ice Cream had been shuttered. I felt that I was just now getting the regulars coming back. What about asking Ziggy to look after the place? Steve suggested. He's not up to making ice cream, but I know he'd fill in for Nate and Harmony every once in a while when they both needed to be somewhere. I wasted no time in trotting over to Veg Ed's and asking Ziggy, who was sitting in the shadow of the truck sketching until a customer showed up, if he was free any time in the next few days to fill in at Island Ice Cream. He seemed pleased to be asked. I could do it tomorrow, he said. Terrific, I told him. I'll make a few extra batches and leave them in the freezer. If you get down to slim pickings, Ziggy looked at me like I'd lapsed into some foreign tongue, which I suppose I had. You couldn't blame a boy who'd spent his whole life on Maui for being unfamiliar with the expression slim pickings. Every once in a while, my southern roots come out. I mean, if you run low on choices, I told him, don't feel like you can't close up early. Oh, said Ziggy, what about Licks? I hadn't stopped to consider Licks. The kitten was currently sleeping under the counter in a box that had formerly held mangoes. I was feeding Licks 6 times a day, and she was thriving, but unless I took the kitten along, I'd have to have someone to look after her. Would you mind cat-sitting too? I asked Ziggy. By the time I was pulling down the awning on the trailer for the evening, it was all arranged. The following morning, I'd meet Steve at Island Ice Cream at 8. Before we took off for Tammy's mother's remote homestead on the other side of the island, I'd hand off the key to the trailer to Ziggy, along with Little Licks and her bottle of formula. I hoped I wasn't placing too much confidence in Ziggy. However, Steve seemed to trust him, and I trusted Steve. The following morning, I got to Island Ice Cream shortly before 8. I'd left Rix at home inside the fenced backyard and hoped he wouldn't start howling out of boredom. I handed off Licks and her bottle of kitten formula to Ziggy, then helped him put the awning up and asked if he had any questions. What do I do with the cash at the end of the day? That was a good question and one I hadn't thought through. Island Ice Cream didn't take credit cards, and typically by the end of a good day there'd be hundreds of dollars in mostly small bills and loose change in the cash box I kept under the counter. Normally, at the end of the day, I'd count out the cash and put it in a zippered pouch to take to the bank the first chance I got, which was often days later. More often than not, there was quite a lot of cash stuffed under the couch cushion in Nate and Harmony's bungalow. Not a very secure place to keep it, I know, but after putting in 9-hour days, I wasn't up to walking the full mile to the bank to deposit the previous day's earnings in the after-hours box. I could have called an Uber every day, but that would cut into my earnings quickly. Just leave it in the cash box under the counter, I told him. No one's ever broken into the trailer as far as I know, and it's unlikely they'd pick tonight to start. Shortly after 8, Steve showed up in his 4-wheel drive Jeep, which he'd deemed essential if we weren't going to go the last 3 miles into Tammy Danson's mother's place on foot. There's only one way in, Steve told me. You've been there? I had a buddy who used to live way up there. It was hard getting into his house, and Tammy's mother lives 2 miles beyond his old place. Why do people live way out there? To get away from the tourists? They wish, said Steve. What do you mean? You'll see. We headed out of town on Haleakala Highway. You've never been to Hana? Steve asked. I haven't been out of Wailuku. Why not? No time and no car? We'll have to fix that, said Steve. It would be a pity if you spent your whole time on Maui doing nothing but selling ice cream. Who knew how long it would be before Nate and Harmony were released? It could be never. I didn't like to say something so depressing out loud, however, so I asked if the road was this good most of the way. Steve just laughed. The 4-lane highway soon ended, but the road was still good as we traveled through what Steve referred to as the upcountry, pointing out places along the way I might enjoy visiting later on when I had the time. As we headed down out of the higher elevations on the center of the island back toward the coastline, everything turned from lush and green to brown and strewn with lava stones. The road became narrower and narrower until it was a single lane. What if we meet someone? I asked. There are turnouts every once in a while. What if we meet someone when there isn't one? One what? A turnout. Then we'll have to squeeze past. Unless it's a tour bus, then someone will probably have to back up for a while until the road widens out. A tour bus? You're joking. Who'd bring a tour bus up here? Don't worry, Steve told me. The tour buses come up the main route and don't usually get over on this side of Hana until after lunchtime. Chapter 21. It was nearly 10 and we were still miles from our destination, but when Steve suggested we take a few minutes to pull off and get a view of the sea caves at Maui Nui Gulch, I was happy for a break from riding in the front seat of Steve's Jeep. While I stood on the windswept orangish earth at the top of the cliff, looking down into the blue water far below and watching the waves crash on the rocks, a thought occurred to me. You haven't seen the police report from the day of the shooting, have you? I asked Steve. No, and I don't imagine the police are inclined to let just anyone have a look at it. I don't think that sort of thing is public record. We probably couldn't march into the police station and demand to see it, I said, but I bet Nate and Harmony's lawyer could. Samantha Pine? Is that her name? Yes, she's an acquaintance of mine, Steve said. That's how she ended up representing Nate and Harmony. I called her myself and engaged her services as soon as the kids were arrested. I haven't spoken about the case with Samantha personally, although I know she's been to visit both Nate and Harmony a couple of times to discuss their defense, so she can be prepared in the event the case ends up going to trial. Do you think Samantha is in possession of the surveillance footage that Lara gave me? I don't know, said Steve, but it's certainly a question worth asking. I'd like to take another closer look at that footage. Why? What are you looking for? I don't know, I admitted. It's just that nothing about this whole thing makes any sense to me. Strokes of bad luck usually don't, Steve pointed out. I wasn't sure if he was referring to Frank Vatu's bad luck in getting shot or Nate and Harmony's bad luck in taking the fall for it. I suppose bad luck is not generally governed by the rules of logic, I conceded, but I still think it's worth taking a look again. And trying to get a meeting with the lawyer? I suppose client-attorney privilege might prevent her from talking to us, I said. Not if the kids tell her to tell us everything she knows. But would she, even if Nate and Harmony gave her the go-ahead? It was worth a try. I have an appointment to visit Nate in a couple of days, I said, and I'm going to see Harmony tomorrow. Let's ask the kids to tell Samantha to cooperate with our amateur investigation. Speaking of which, said Steve, we'd better get going. After we went a few more miles on the single-lane paved road through a completely deserted open grassland strewn with rocks, it got a little greener, and I started to see more signs of human life. We passed a few roads, taking off into the uplands that sloped up to meet what Steve told me was the backside of Haleakala Mountain. The road was lined with a mix of old stone walls and broken-down barbed wire fences, as it narrowed even further into what reminded me a little of the English country lanes I'd navigated in a rental car with my late mother when I'd taken her to see her ancestral homeland. Driving those narrow English country lanes had been a terrifying experience for me. I've always been a rather timid driver, and my anxieties had not been helped by very nearly hitting a sheep on the second day of our road trip. There aren't any sheep around here, are there? I asked as we barreled along the potholed pavement that appeared to be made up entirely of patches. Sheep? Not that I know of. We might very well run into a pig, though. A pig? I said just before Steve slammed on the brakes so hard that only my seatbelt prevented my face from hitting the dashboard. Chapter 22. Steve stopped in time to avoid hitting a trio of small pigs that darted across the road in front of us. "Did those pigs escape from a farm?" I asked as I tried to tamp down the shot of adrenaline running through my veins. It was hardly an auspicious start to the decidedly nerve-wracking task of trespassing on Tammy's mother's property and looking for evidence Tammy was connected with the attempts to burn the jewelry stolen from Frank's safe. "In a way, I suppose," said Steve. "At some point, many generations back, the pigs around here did belong to someone, but they've been running wild around here for decades. They're feral now. They'd look just like ordinary domestic porkers, albeit on the small side, but I didn't have an opportunity to ask any more about the feral pigs because Steve announced that we'd reached the side road leading to the homestead belonging to Tammy's mother. "There's only one way in and out," said Steve, "and only a couple of houses up this way, so in case we are confronted, I suggest we act like a couple of confused tourists who've lost their way." "What about the car?" I said. "It doesn't look like a rental." "We're visiting from—" "Where is it you're from?" "Austin." "You do all the talking," said Steve. There was no need to ask why. I was born and raised in Texas, and there's no way anyone would question that story once I opened my mouth. "What about the car?" I repeated. "We borrowed it from our son's father-in-law," he said. That wasn't straying too far from the truth, at least not where I was concerned. "Not that I expect anyone to get that aggressive in their questioning," Steve continued. "At worst, I expect you'll just give any angry locals your lost tourist story. They'll hear your accent and accept it without question. The worst that will happen is we'll get yelled at a little. You wouldn't believe how often tourists wander off the beaten path and trespass on private property. The locals hate it, understandably, but I've never heard of it leading to violence." "I hope so. Is the road like this the whole way?" "It gets worse," said Steve. Fortunately, it hadn't rained in a while, but the road had deep ruts and washed out portions that were evidence that it had, numerous times in the past, turned into more of a stream of muddy water washing down the hillside than a road. I couldn't imagine it getting worse, but it did right after we had passed two houses fairly close together that Steve thought were the only others on the road. "How much longer?" I asked. "At least a mile. Hopefully we won't have to get out and walk before we get there." 5 minutes later, we reached a point where the washed-out depression running down the center of the road became a deep, impassable gully. Steve stopped the Jeep on the steep incline, shut off the engine, set the parking brake, and said, "This is it. We walk from here after I find a rock to chock the wheels. Won't abandoning our car in the middle of the road mess with our lost tourist story?" I asked. "Not really," said Steve. "That's exactly the sort of thing a lost tourist would do. Believe me, people up here have seen every variation of lost tourist there is. Besides, no one can get up the road now to ask any questions. Unless there's someone already up there." "That's pretty unlikely." I asked around and made sure that Mary is still staying at the rehab center down in Wailuku. "Mary? That's Tammy Danson's mother's name?" "Mary Smith," Steve said. "And you're sure Mary lives alone?" "Absolutely certain," said Steve as he wedged a rock behind one of the back wheels. "Make sure you bring your water bottle along." I'm not sure how far we'll have to walk. Steve and I walked for 40 minutes before we came to the end of the road, which terminated at a gate with a sign on it informing us that we had reached private land, although I suspected we had been crossing private land for quite some time. The gate was open, and we went through it. I'd expected to feel uneasy, but as we approached an old wooden one-story house that might once have been white, but was now a grayish-green and had a rusty metal roof that was half covered over with a tarp, I was downright jittery. "Should we knock on the door?" I asked Steve in nearly a whisper. "Let's just have a quiet look around," said Steve. "We're looking for evidence of burning, and I don't see a chimney on the house." "All right," I said, keeping a vigilant eye on the house, which had glass louvered windows that were cranked shut and closed curtains that restricted the view of the interior. If there was anyone inside, they must enjoy sitting around in the dark. Everything was off-grid way up here, and I didn't even see any solar panels, just an old generator with a cord running in through a window. The generator sat silent. As we quietly circled around the overgrown yard to the back of the house, I realized there was a shed in the back, or possibly another, smaller dwelling. Next to the outbuilding was a patch of blackened earth with a pile of ashes in the center of it. I pointed wordlessly to the spot. "Bingo," said Steve, a little too loudly for my nerves. "Let's work quickly," I said. "This whole place is giving me the creeps." Steve seemed completely calm, but he didn't waste any time getting down to business. He picked up a couple of sticks off the ground and handed me one, and we started to sift through the ashes. I was hoping we would find a ruby cocktail ring, or at least the remains of one in the ashes, but after we'd sifted through most of the small pile of cinders, ash, and remains of old tin cans, we'd found nothing to connect this place with the destruction of the ill-gotten gains taken from Frank's filling station. "I guess that's it," I said, standing to my feet and brushing bits of ash from my pant legs. "Wait," Steve said. "I think I've found some burnt money." "Money?" Steve held up an ash-covered bill that was badly singed on one end. "Let me see that." Steve handed it over. It was money, all right, and the late President George Washington had been altered to impersonate Charlie Chaplin. It was all there just as Lara had described it. The black-marked bowler hat, the bow tie, and the mustache. "What shall we do with it?" Steve asked. "Put it back," I said. "Isn't it evidence?" "It is," I said, "but we're hardly in the position of alerting the police to its existence." "I suppose not," said Steve and stuck it back in the ashes. "We'd just be suspected of planting evidence." "And we can't keep it either," I said, "or it will look like we did the burning." "True, maybe this whole outing was a waste." Steve looked more discouraged than I'd ever seen him. "It wasn't a waste," I insisted. "Now we know for certain that Tammy Danson had something to do with the robbery. Otherwise, what would that defaced bill be doing up here at her mother's place?" "It looks that way," said Steve. "Now we just have to prove it." "How?" Steve had me there, but I refused to consider defeat. "We have multiple paths forward," I insisted. "We'll take another look at the surveillance tape. We'll meet with Samantha the lawyer, and I'll make another circuit around the neighborhood near the filling station." "We haven't exhausted?" I'd been putting my all into my pep talk, but I sensed Steve wasn't listening to me. "What is it?" I asked. But Steve didn't answer. He was looking back down the hill in the direction we'd come up the dirt road that led to the house. He put his finger to his lips, and I listened. At first, I didn't know what he was listening for, but then I heard it too. It sounded like the engine of a motorcycle. Chapter 23. "Is that motorcycle coming here?" I asked as we stood listening to the sound of the motor in the distance. "Must be," said Steve. "There's no place else it could be heading for. We'll have to hide." "But how? Your Jeep is in the way. An on-off-road sport bike could easily make it around," said Steve. "We'd better make ourselves scarce." "The shed? I think the forest is safer. But I want to see who it is." In the end, we compromised and hunkered down behind a log that was shielded by a mixture of ferns and small shrubs partially smothered in a network of vines. When I peeked over the log, I still had a clear view of the house, but I was confident of not being seen. "Unfortunately, whoever is coming is going to wonder where the occupants of the car we abandoned in the middle of the road are," I said as the sound of the motorcycle grew louder. "I think we'd better just get a quick look at whoever is coming, then start circling around through the edge of the clearing and try to make it back to the Jeep. I'd like to get out of here before whoever is riding that motorcycle finishes his business here and decides to come looking for us." That seemed like a sensible plan, and I made no objections to it. The motorcycle entered the clearing, and the rider parked it by the front step of the house and removed his helmet. He had an air of having been there before, and contrary to my fears, he didn't appear to be someone who suspected there were trespassers on the premises. As soon as he removed his jacket and his helmet, I knew who he was. Sort of, anyway. He had bleached blonde hair with dark roots and a full-sleeve, brightly colored tattoo down one arm. The man was tall, thin, and graceful, which Zoe had failed to note, although there was a little hitch in his step as if one leg were slightly shorter than the other. "That's him," I hissed to Steve. "That's the guy that planted the jewelry under the steps." "Let's go," Steve hissed back, practically pulling me to my feet under cover of the vegetation. I was about to let him pull me away from the scene when I saw the man raise his phone to his ear. "Wait," I whispered, dropping to the ground again. For a few seconds, the man held the phone to his ear and waited for the other party to pick up. "What am I looking for again?" he asked. Fortunately, he had a robust and carrying voice. The other party talked for a while, then the man said, "With what on it?" More talking from the other party. "Who?" asked the man. More talking. "I have no idea who that is." More talking. "Fine, I'll take a look at it." The man appeared to hang up and then looked at his phone before muttering inaudibly to himself as if whatever he was looking at on the screen of his phone was profoundly unhelpful. Then he headed around the back of the house. "He's headed for the burn pile," I whispered. "Possibly," Steve whispered back. "We should go while he's occupied." "I want to see," I said. Steve wasn't happy about it, but we crept through the undergrowth until we had a view of the burn pile and the man who was now down on his hands and knees sifting through it using one of the sticks we'd just employed for the same purpose. It didn't take him long to find the half-burned bill, which he took a picture of before pulling a lighter from his pocket and setting it aflame. It physically pained me to see prime evidence literally going up in smoke, but it doubly confirmed that the man we now observed from a safe distance in the undergrowth was in cahoots with the robbers. I tried to comfort myself that even if we'd taken the half-burned bill away with us, it would have been useless for us to take it to the police. If anything, it would have further incriminated Nate and Harmony. After the man dropped the remaining corner of the flaming bill into the ashes, I expected that he'd leave, but it appeared that he had not completed his task. He had his phone to his ear again, and after informing the party on the other end that he'd finished burning it, he asked, "Where is that ring buried again?" After listening to the person on the other end of the line for another minute or two, the man hung up and pulled a folding knife from his pocket. Knife in hand, the man headed around to the front of the house, apparently in search of a buried ring. Under the circumstances, I couldn't imagine the ring in question was any other than the missing ruby cocktail ring, assuming Laura had been feeding me accurate information. I badly wanted to see the man unearth the ring with my own two eyes, but Steve was anxious to head back to the car. Early on in our excursion, I had been the one who was a bundle of nerves. Now it seemed that Steve and I had exchanged roles. "We have to go past the front of the house anyway to get back to the road," I pointed out in a whisper. "Let's just linger a little as we pass by and see what he digs up. As soon as he finds what he's looking for, he's going to leave." "What's the harm in that?" "He's already seen the Jeep, and he doesn't seem a bit concerned that he might not be entirely alone up here." My optimism was short-lived, however, because just then I went head over heels as I tripped over a trailing vine. I may have let out a tiny shriek as I went down. "Run!" Steve hissed as I still lay on the damp earth with my face planted in a fern. "What?" "He's coming!" Steve was pulling me to my feet, but it was a useless gesture. "I can't run," I said. "I think I sprained my ankle." "Then get your Texas tourist story ready," Steve whispered in my ear as he held me upright, "because our friend with the knife also appears to be armed with a gun." I turned my head to see the man advancing toward us with a handgun drawn. Our view of the man was partially obscured by plant life, and I wasn't sure he'd seen us, but he'd clearly heard the commotion I'd made as I'd gone down. "I'm sorry," I whispered to Steve. "You make a run for it." "No, I'm not leaving you. You don't have to go far. There's no point in blowing both our covers." "Who's there?" the man demanded through the bracken. He was in the undergrowth now, although his trajectory for finding us was considerably off. "Hide behind that big stump over there," I hissed at Steve. "Once he finds me, he'll probably stop looking. What about you?" "I'll talk my way out of it." "I hope you know what you're doing," Steve whispered just before he concealed himself behind the stump. There was no use postponing the inevitable. I couldn't run, and there was nowhere to hide for long without discovery, so I yelled, "Help! I've fallen and I can't get up," in my best Texas twang. It wasn't entirely true that I could not get up. If I'd had to, I could have hobbled all the way back to the Jeep, although it would be slow and painful going. I continued yelling in my very best hysterical damsel in distress voice until the man materialized out of the foliage to my left. I was relieved to see that he'd put his gun away. "Are you all right?" he asked. I made it abundantly clear by moaning and clutching at my ankle that I was not. "I think I've broken something," I said. "What were you doing out here?" the man asked. It was a reasonable question. "I was looking for wild orchids," I said. "I'm a member of the Dallas Orchid Society, and we have this checklist, and since I was already here on vacation, I figured I ought to at least try to add to my list of finds. There's a prize for a..." The man was listening to me babble without saying a word. I couldn't tell if he believed me or not, so I forged ahead with my story. I read there was this rare variety that grows wild on the backside of Haleakala, and I wanted to find it and take a picture with it so I could win the... "You came out here by yourself?" the man demanded. "Sure," I said. "I heard Hawaii is very safe. I read it has the 35th lowest violent crime rate out of all the states." The man gave me a cool, impassive stare for several seconds before he said, "You could die out here." Chapter 24. I couldn't tell if the man's statement that I could die out here was intended as a threat or as a statement of fact. "People do it every year," he continued. "They go for hikes, get off the trail, and never make it out again." I decided the man was not threatening me. I was convinced every word he said was true. I'd have had to be an idiot to come out here by myself to wander the wilds of the back slope of Haleakala looking for wild orchids. Come to think of it, Steve and I had been none too wise in coming out here without telling anyone where we were going. I couldn't help wondering how Steve was doing there behind his stump. "That your Jeep parked in the road?" the man asked. "Yes, I borrowed it from my son." "Well, tell your son he shouldn't let his mother go off by herself like that." The man had now approached, so he was standing so close to me that he could have reached out and touched me. I decided it was time to dial back the extent of my injuries, or he'd be trying to carry me out of there. It seemed he'd bought my idiot orchid hunter story. All I had to do was get back to the Jeep, convince the man to take off and leave me in peace, and then wait for Steve to join me. It would have been an easier scheme to pull off if I'd been in possession of the keys. It was going to be hard to explain to the man why I couldn't get into my own car. "I'm Matt," he said. "I'm Luann," I told him. That's not entirely a lie. Luann is my middle name. Matt insisted on loading me onto the back of his motorcycle. Even though he'd been coming at us with a gun in hand, I was considerably less worried about my personal safety than I had been a few minutes earlier. Apparently, Matt might involve himself as an accessory to armed robbery resulting in grievous bodily harm, or at least the disposal of stolen goods resulting from such. But his violent tendencies did not extend themselves to attacking airheaded middle-aged lady tourists in distress. I hoped nothing would occur to disabuse him of the delusion that I was an airheaded middle-aged lady tourist. The mile or so back down to the Jeep was torture, not just because my ankle was throbbing, but because I repeatedly failed to come up with a plan guaranteed to convince Matt to leave me alone at the abandoned Jeep. I toyed with texting Linda for assistance while I was clinging to the back of the bike, but I waited until we'd gotten to Steve's vehicle. "I'll text a friend to come and drive me out," I told Matt as I pointed to my twisted ankle. I thought it was a watertight alibi until Matt said, "I kind of figured your boyfriend would drive you out." My boyfriend? Are you telling me that guy hiding behind the stump isn't your boyfriend? What? I don't believe your name is Luann either. It is, I insisted. And you weren't looking for orchids, Matt continued. I was. Whatever you say, said Matt. I just stood there looking back at him and trying not to dwell on how easily he could pull out that gun he'd been brandishing earlier and shoot me dead with it. I really had been an imbecile not to tell anyone where I'd been going. Ziggy knew I was going with Steve to Hana, but beyond that, nobody knew exactly where we were. The backside of Haleakala encompassed numerous side roads and thousands of acres. If Matt decided to shoot me and then lie in wait for Steve and finish him off too, it could be days before anyone discovered our bodies. "I know what you are thinking, Mrs. Rose," Matt said. He'd known who I was the whole time? What kind of game was he playing? "What am I thinking? You think I'm going to kill you? Are you?" "No, this thing isn't even loaded," he said, patting the bulge in his jacket where his handgun was. I didn't entirely believe him, and that wasn't even addressing the fact he had a knife as a backup weapon. "I don't kill people," Matt said in much the same impassive, matter-of-fact tone he'd have used to express an opinion on the chance of rain. Was Matt trying to say he wasn't the one who'd shot Frank? "Who did shoot Frank?" I said, surprising even myself with the question. Chapter 25. When I asked Matt who shot Frank, his face betrayed no emotion. "It wasn't me," he finally said. "Do you know who did do it?" I asked. "You'll have to ask Frank that." That was the problem. No one could ask Frank anything, and even if I could ask him, would he have any idea who had been behind the mask when the trigger was pulled? "You sure you'll be all right until that boyfriend of yours shows up, Mrs. Rose?" Matt asked. "He's not my boyfriend." "Whatever you say, Cynthia Luann," Matt said, gunned his engine, and took off down the dirt track, leaving me alone with the locked Jeep in the middle of the wilds of what Steve would later inform me locals referred to as the Beyond. I waited, and waited some more. Finally, Steve emerged from the foliage lining the side of the road, his pant leg torn and his leg bloodied. "What happened to you?" I said. "I slid into a small ravine. Are you okay with driving?" "I might be able to. My ankle's hurting a lot less now. It's probably just a mild sprain." "I'm fine to drive," said Steve. "Where's Motorcycle Man?" "He left me here to wait for you." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, just a little shaken." "Did he threaten you?" "Not exactly." I had a feeling Steve would not find the whole truth reassuring, however, so I said, "No, but he was completely on to us the whole time." "He knew who you were?" Steve was looking at me in disbelief. "Did he know I was with you?" "Yes, and yes," I said. "He even knew my middle name." The only thing Matt had gotten wrong about us was Steve being my boyfriend, but I wasn't about to bring that up. "That's not good," said Steve. "Not at all good. Do you think he followed us up here?" The question had occurred to me, but why exactly would Matt have been tailing us in the first place? Matt? His name is Matt. Matt who? I have no idea, I told Steve. He appears to know a lot more about me than I know about him. "Why would he let us see him?" Steve said. If he really did follow us up here, he had to have known we were watching his every move. That I don't know. Of course, we don't know for sure that he did follow us. If he didn't follow us, it would be an awfully lucky coincidence. Lucky for who? I wasn't feeling particularly lucky myself. Good question, said Steve. I had a sinking feeling that Steve and I were being played, but how or why eluded me. Was Lara the one setting us up? If Matt was involved, that made no sense because, according to Martin's description of the man he'd seen repeatedly going in and out of Tammy Danson's house, Matt must be in league with Tammy. Had Tammy and Matt had a falling out, and now he was in league with Lara in trying to implicate the Dansons? Lara believed, or at least wanted Steve and me to believe, that Tammy Danson was directly involved in Frank's shooting. Lara, Tammy, and Matt couldn't all be on the same side, could they? Surely not, when one of them was accusing the other of attempted murder. It made my head hurt, trying to make sense of it. "Let's get out of here," said Steve. I didn't disagree with that. "We can get a bite to eat in Hana," Steve suggested, "and then I'll take you to see the Black Sand Beach before we head back." "How much farther is Hana?" I asked. "A hop, skip, and a jump," said Steve. It was not a hop, skip, and a jump to Hana. At least not by my standards, and that's saying a lot considering I grew up in Texas. By the time we were back on the main road, it was almost 2 in the afternoon, and there was now significant traffic coming in the other direction. We had to inch over onto the side of the narrow road, which in places meant we were hugged up against a steep drop-off into the ocean below. At one point, a tour bus met us head-on. "Who's going to back up?" I asked. "No one is," said Steve as he reached out to adjust the Jeep's driver's side mirror in as far as it would go. "Just watch. He'll make it. Those tour bus drivers are no joke." We idled on the edge of the narrow lane while the tour bus stuffed to the gills with tourists maneuvered past at the pace of a geriatric snail. Our mirrors missed each other by fractions of an inch. We passed by the 7 sacred pools of Ohio, which Steve informed me were beautiful and not to be missed, except we'd have to miss them. The parking lot was full, and no more visitors were being admitted. We ate Thai food at a little place in the town proper, then stopped to see the Black Sand Beach at the state park right outside of town. The sand, as promised, was indeed black. I'd never seen anything like it. As I stood with my bare toes digging into the coarse sand of the small beach sheltered inside a lava-rimmed cove and watched the waves wash up, I couldn't help thinking it was all too beautiful to be quite real. It was no wonder Nate had urged me all these years to come and visit. "You'll love it, Mom," he'd said too many times to count. Now that I was finally here, we couldn't enjoy it together. "It's the only black sand beach on Maui," Steve told me. "And there are lots more things worth seeing around here, but let's leave that to another time." Steve was right. We weren't on vacation. I needed to get back down to Island Ice Cream and collect the cash from the box under the counter. Check to be sure that nothing had run too much amuck under Ziggy's inexperienced care. Pick up licks from Auntie Alma's, where Ziggy had left her before heading home for the night. And give Rix his supper. There was no time for sitting on a beach and watching the sun go down. The drive down from Hana was nearly as harrowing as the trip in. The road was better, but the traffic was heavy and going at what I felt was a reckless speed, considering it was still essentially a 1-lane road in places. "Are you sleepy?" Steve asked when I closed my eyes for the umpteenth time to avoid seeing a collision with an oncoming car that never materialized. "No," I said, "just resting my eyes. I was so full of anxiety-induced adrenaline that I couldn't have fallen asleep if I'd wanted to. At least, that's what I thought. However, once we were back on the highway, I felt my eyelids growing heavy, and the next thing I knew, Steve was telling me we were back in Wailuku and asking if I'd told Ziggy to leave the door to the trailer ajar. I roused myself enough to look out the window of Steve's Jeep. The awning on the trailer was down, as it always was when Island Ice Cream was closed for business, but the door on the side of the trailer was standing wide open. "Ziggy must still be here," I said. Chapter 26. I stood outside the open door of the trailer with Steve standing close behind me. I called out for Ziggy, expecting him to answer. He did not. I pushed the door open all the way and stuck my head inside. The old Airstream trailer that housed Island Ice Cream was not exactly spacious. The batch freezer, the flash freezer, and a small stainless steel work surface with a tiny refrigerator and storage underneath took up the back wall. Most of the front wall, which opened up to the outdoors when the awning was raised, was lined by the dipping bays where the finished ice cream was served to customers after they'd selected their flavor of choice. It was in a small recess to the left of the dipping bays underneath a counter where we kept our cones and cups at the ready where the cash box usually stayed. I'd instructed Ziggy to put the day's takings inside the cash box and leave it underneath the counter for me to pick up later. Ziggy was gone, and when I reached down to remove the cash box from under the counter, I discovered it, too, was missing. "It's gone," I told Steve, who was standing at the open door of the trailer. "What's gone?" "The cash box." "Maybe Ziggy is still around here somewhere," Steve suggested. I thought that unlikely, but since the boy was dating the daughter of the woman who owned the nail salon a few yards away, I conceded that Ziggy might have gone there. "I did tell him to be very sure that the extension cord was plugged in," I said. "Island Ice Cream poached power from an outlet on the back wall of the salon, for a price, of course." "I'll check," Steve said. "You keep looking for the cash box." I kept looking. I got down on my hands and knees and used the light on my phone to search every nook and cranny in the place. By the time Steve returned, I hadn't found the cash box, but I had examined the door to the trailer and determined that someone had forced it open. "Esther says Ziggy left about 40 minutes ago," Steve told me. "Someone forced the lock on the door," I said, pointing to where the flimsy aluminum of the curved door had been bent. "It looks like somebody took a crowbar to it. What should I do?" "File a police report," said Steve. "It's very unlikely that you'll ever recover the money, but they might put extra patrols on to keep it from happening again." "It won't happen again," I said grimly. "How can you be sure?" "Because I will never leave cash on the premises again." "Just the same," Steve said, "I think you should report the theft. I'll call it in for you if you want. Hopefully, they'll have someone they can send out right away." "Go ahead, I guess. I'm going to go ask Esther if she saw anything unusual in the last half hour." "What about Ed?" Steve asked, inclining his head toward the truck that housed Veg Ed's place of business. "I don't think he's here," I said as I eyed the closed sign on the side of the truck. "You ought to let him know anyway. He might have gotten broken into, too." I walked over to Ed's truck and tried the doors as I circled the vehicle. Everything appeared undisturbed and secured until I got to the driver's side door, which opened easily. "Come here," I yelled to Steve, who hurried over with his phone to his ear. I climbed up on the running board of Veg Ed's truck and heaved the heavy metal door open under the watchful eye of Steve, who was still on hold with the police department. "They're getting me the desk sergeant," he told me. To say Veg Ed was not neat would be an understatement. He obviously treated the cab of his truck, which rarely moved, as a storage unit. On the passenger side was a box of clamshell takeout containers, a half-dozen long plastic sleeves containing cups, a toppled stack of poorly folded rags, and a gallon of cleaning concentrate. On the driver's seat, however, there was only one object, a zippered vinyl bank bag. "Empty?" Steve asked as I held up the bank bag for him to see. "I don't think so," I said, and slid the zipper open. It was full of cash, obviously the proceeds of at least one day's worth of sales. "I don't know what to think," I said. "Better call Ed," said Steve. After what happened to Island Ice Cream, he shouldn't be leaving cash lying around in plain sight like that. Don't you think it's odd? Don't I think what's odd? Veg Ed left several $100s worth of cash lying around in plain sight and unattended in an open vehicle. Yet Island Ice Cream is the one who got broken into. I didn't get Steve's reaction to my question because just then the desk sergeant he'd been holding for finally picked up. While Steve dealt with the police, I dialed Ed. "We got broken into," I said. "We?" "Sometime after Ziggy left for the evening, someone pried the door open on the trailer and stole the cash box." "What?" "Ziggy is not a suspect," I hastily added. "Esther saw him leaving about 40 minutes before Steve and I got here and found the door open and the money missing." "That's good to know," Ed said. "What about my truck?" "That's the funny thing. I went to check on your truck. Did you know you left the driver's side door unlocked and your cash bag lying out on the seat?" "Is the money gone?" Ed asked. "No, that's what's so strange about the whole thing." Ed conceded that it was indeed strange that only Island Ice Cream had been targeted but offered no theories as to why. "Ziggy make it home all right?" I asked. "Not sure," said Ed. "He's staying at his mother's tonight. Will you be at Island Ice Cream for a bit?" "Either Steve or I will." "Good. I'll come down and get that bank bag and lock up my truck." Ed sounded slightly rattled, which surprised me. If anyone had a right to be rattled, it was me. It had been quite a day. As soon as I hung up with Ed, Steve rounded the corner of the truck and informed me that the police would have someone out to take pictures and write up the incident as soon as they could spare an officer. "How long will that be?" I asked. "Who knows?" "I need to get home and feed Licks and Ricks." "I can stay here and deal with the police report." After all, I think what he wanted to say was that even though I was the one currently keeping Island Ice Cream afloat, we were both equally responsible for the affairs of our respective children while they were incarcerated. Island Ice Cream was Nate and Harmony's joint endeavor. There was no reason why Steve couldn't just as well deal with the break-in. "I'd really appreciate that," I told him and headed off on foot for home. Quizzing Esther from the nail salon about any suspicious characters hanging around the place would have to wait. I had hungry mouths to feed. Chapter 27. I was just raising my hand to knock on Auntie Alma's door in the hopes of collecting licks when my phone dinged. It was Steve. "Samantha can meet with us tomorrow." "What about getting the go-ahead from Nate and Harmony?" "She says it doesn't matter." I wasn't sure how I felt about meeting with Nate and Harmony's lawyer without getting the kids' express permission. On the one hand, I couldn't imagine why they'd object. But on the other, I wasn't sure how I felt about a lawyer who was so cavalier about potentially violating attorney-client privilege. I decided not to make a fuss. "When and where?" "I'll pick you up at 6 right after you close up." Steve had mentioned that Samantha Pine had ended up representing Nate and Harmony because of some personal relationship he had with her. Samantha's willingness to meet with us after hours at short notice made me wonder just how close a relationship she and Steve had. The thought of Steve having a close, personal relationship with another woman bothered me far more than it should have. If there was one man on the entire island that I'd be unwise to get involved with, it was my son's girlfriend's father. That was way too fraught with potential complications. I decided that it did not matter what kind of relationship Samantha had with Steve. What mattered was if she was in possession of any information that would lead us to whoever had shot Frank Vatu and left him for dead. While I was standing there on Alma Tanaka's front porch, my phone in my hand, the door opened without me even having to announce my presence. "I assume you're here for this little creature?" Alma said as she thrust the box containing Licks, who was sound asleep, into my hands. "How long ago did Ziggy drop her off?" I asked. "I didn't look at the time," said Alma, "but it's been a while. I was expecting you a lot earlier." "Something happened," I said. The trailer got broken into. Someone stole the cash box. We had to wait for the police to come, and it took them a while. I'm sure it wasn't Ziggy, said Alma. He's a good boy. He's so good to his grandfather. That was quite a change of heart from calling the police on Ziggy because he was unrepentantly painting on the walls of buildings. But since I agreed with Auntie Alma's current assessment of Ziggy's character, I limited my remarks to reassuring her that I was also certain it wasn't Ziggy who'd absconded with the cash box. It was probably just a random break-in, I said. I didn't mention that Veg Ed's takings from the day had been undisturbed despite being left out in the open inside an unlocked vehicle. I've been thinking, said Mrs. Tanaka. I have a feeling you might be barking up the wrong tree. I think the metaphor might have come to her because poor Rix had clearly caught on to my arrival and was setting up a din of happy howling from where he was contained in the backyard. I don't know what you mean by barking up the wrong tree, I said. I have no clue who might have stolen the cash box. I'm not talking about the stolen cash box, said Alma. What do you mean? I asked Alma. I heard from Grace that Frank was about to declare bankruptcy. Bankruptcy? It looked to me like he does a pretty good business. He probably does, but in business it's easy to get underwater if you borrow money. Did Frank borrow money? Alma shrugged. I don't know the details, but Grace heard from her sister, who heard it from Frank's niece, that Frank was contemplating bankruptcy. Frank's niece, Laura? I don't know the niece's name. I can ask Grace. Could you? I hurried down the steps, wondering why Alma had thought it so urgent to inform me about Frank's fragile financial situation, even if her sources had gotten it straight. Was she suggesting that perhaps one of Frank's creditors had decided to get back some of the money he owed them by holding up the place? If so, why would they have shot him after getting their hands on the contents of the safe? Had the shot been a warning gone wrong? Shooting a man in the stomach seemed a very drastic way of issuing a warning. As I understood it, Frank Vatu was still unconscious, although why a single shot to the abdomen would render someone comatose made little sense to me. Rix was overjoyed to see me. He was so excited to interact with another living creature that he knocked Lix's box right out of my hands. The box tumbled down the steps of the cottage, ejecting little Lix, who scrambled out onto the wooden tread, suddenly awake and unharmed. I'm sure I would not have noticed it otherwise, but Lix taking a tumble was what alerted me to the fact that the board which concealed the charred jewelry box taken from the gas station heist was askew. After we'd found the box, Steve and I had decided that it might be best to leave the steps unrepaired. Someone had planted that box of jewelry, and although I couldn't quite put my finger on the logic behind our convictions, we'd both agreed that it might be best to pretend we hadn't found it. After the discovery, Steve had put his tools away and left the worn tread as he'd found it. I picked up Lix and put her up on the porch, where she immediately became fascinated with a small beetle. Then I poured out a bowl of kibble for Rix to occupy him while I investigated. It was already dusky, so I pulled out my phone and shone the light onto the loose board as I prepared to push it aside. At first, when I peered into the dark void under the steps, I was convinced that the box was still there. It had to be. The reason I could not see it when I shone my light onto the dirt under the steps must be that Steve, in his zealousness to hide the box again, had tucked it farther back when he replaced it. However, further investigation proved otherwise. The charred jewelry box containing the 2 gold necklaces and the diamond solitaire ring had vanished into thin air. I called Steve, who picked up after the first ring. "It's gone," I said. "What's gone?" "The jewelry box." "The kid's place got broken into, too?" "No, I don't think so. I haven't even been inside. I meant the jewelry box hidden under the front steps."
This is the end of part 3. Check the Mangoes and Malice playlist on this channel for the remaining part.